And there's a wonderful story about Hakuin, who lived in the 18th century in Japan. This was his first kensho, and I'm going to read. He wrote it in his own autobiography, so let me read it. It says, "The spring of my 24th year found me in the monks' quarters of the Eiganji monastery, pursuing my strenuous studies. Night and day, I did not sleep. I forgot to eat and rest. Suddenly, a great doubt manifested itself before me. It was as though I was frozen solid in the midst of an ice sheet extending tens of thousands of miles. A purity filled my breast, and I could neither go forward nor retreat. To all intents and purposes, I was out of my mind, and Mu alone remained. Although I sat in the lecture hall and listened to the master's lecture, it was as though I was hearing a discussion from the distance outside the hall. At times it felt as though I were floating in the air. This state lasted for several days. Then I chanced to hear the sound of the temple bell, and I was suddenly transformed. It was as if a sheet of ice had been smashed, or a jade tower had fallen with a crash. Suddenly, I returned to my senses. I felt that I had achieved the status of Yento, who through the 3 periods of times encountered not the slightest loss." That's Gento, actually. And although my former doubts vanished, as though ice had melted away, in a loud voice I called, "Wonderful, wonderful, there is no cycle of birth and death through which one must pass. There is no enlightenment one must seek. The 1700 koans handed down from the past have not the slightest value whatsoever." My pride soared up like a majestic mountain. My arrogance surged forth like the tide. Smugly I thought to myself, in the past 200 or 300 years, no one could have accomplished such a miraculous breakthrough as this. So, shouldering my glorious enlightenment, I set out at once for Shimano, calling on Master Shoju. I told him my experience and presented him with a verse. The master held my verse with his left hand and said to me, "This verse is what you've learned from study. Now show me what your intuition has to say." And he held out his right hand. I replied, "If there were something intuitive that I could show you, I'd vomit it out," and I made a gagging sound. And the master said, "How do you understand Joshu's Mu?" And I replied, "What sort of place does Mu have that one can attach arms and legs to it?" And the master twisted my nose with his finger and said, "Here's some place to attach arms and legs." I was nonplussed, and the master gave a hearty laugh. "You poor hole-dwelling devil," he cried. I paid him no attention. He continued, "Do you think somehow you have sufficient understanding?" I answered, "What do you think is missing?" From then on, every time he saw me, the master called me a poor hole-dwelling devil. After I devoted myself to an intense study of the koan, not pausing to sleep or eat, one day I had an awakening, and I went to the master's room to test my understanding, but he would not approve it. All he did was call me a poor hole-dwelling devil. I began to think that I'd better leave and go someplace else. One day, when I'd gone to town to beg for food, I encountered a madman who tried to beat me with a broom. Unexpectedly, I found that I had penetrated the koan. Then the other koans that had puzzled me fell into place by themselves, and I penetrated them all. And when I returned to the temple, I spoke of the understanding I had gained, and the master neither approved nor denied what I said. He only laughed pleasantly. But from then on, he stopped calling me a poor hole-dwelling. So here's Hakuin, writes very eloquently about his first awakening experience, but his master wouldn't approve him because he was still holding on to his own pride and arrogance. So there's whatever we think we've accomplished can become another attachment. We have to just keep letting go of it. So I have lots of other stories, but maybe it's enough of those. But let me just go back to the main point that the most difficult attachment to let go of is the attachment to the idea of self. So the single source of our mental afflictions and our inability to penetrate deeply into our practice is the delusion that identifies events and objects as being independent and then grasps at these phenomena. It's called self-grasping ignorance, grasping after a self. One of the aims of practice is to dissolve that self-grasping ignorance. It's not necessarily to make oneself empty or blank, but to examine and investigate the nature of ignorance that is grasping onto the concept of self. As the third patriarch said, to cease cherishing our opinions. So looking for enlightenment, what one ancient said is searching for a donkey while riding on a donkey. And then holding on to anything we realize is like getting on the donkey and not being willing to get down once you realize you're on it. See, then it becomes a sickness, holding on to it. So I have a few more verses I want to share, but these verses are on the finger pointing at the moon. The other verses was on the finger pointing to the whole dwelling devil. So Dogen wrote, looking for Buddha outside your own mind, and Buddha becomes the devil. There's a Zen monk poet named Ryokan who Gento selected to give his talk about in a few weeks. And he said, where beauty is, then there's ugliness. Where right is, also there's wrong. Knowledge and ignorance are interdependent. Delusion and enlightenment condition each other. Since olden times it has been so. How can it be otherwise now? Wanting to get rid of one and grab the other is merely realizing a scene of stupidity, even if you speak of the wonder of it all. How will you deal with each thing changing? How will you deal with each thing changing? In other words, what's right today may be wrong tomorrow. What's wrong today may be right tomorrow. Same thing with enlightenment and delusion. If we become enlightened, if we realize something and hold on to it, it's delusion. And if we totally become one with our delusion, then it becomes enlightenment. So love and hate are dual concepts. They're duality. So how do we transcend that duality? What is the love that is not opposed to hate? Say the same thing. Enlightenment and delusion are dual concepts. But what is it when you transcend both of them? We can say, what is the enlightenment that is not opposed to delusion?